What do you know about bank robberies in the 20th century? You probably think of Bonnie and Clyde or the name of John Dillinger. When it comes to robberies, everyone imagines a group of guys breaking into the bank, waving guns, shouting on bank employees to open the vault and hand over all the cash. But what if I told you about the greatest bank robbery in the Soviet Union in its entire history, during which not a single shot was fired, and what's more, the robbers didn't even have a gun with them? This story is very similar to the plot of Ocean's 11, with only difference that there were three friends and only one direct implementer. This story is about how to rob a bank with two key things: great luck and great negligence of the bank employees. But first things first, my name is Tommy and we begin. This story we're gonna talk about today happened in Armenia, then the Armenian Republic of the Soviet Union, in 1977. And the reason for its appearance was an ordinary Soviet feast, or just a party. The people who gathered together in the winter evening were drinking and enjoying their meal. But we are only interested in three of them: cousins Nikolai Kalachan, and Felix Kalachan. And their friend Zaven Bagdasaryan. The last one was an employee of the State Bank of Armenia, and the cousins were just petty thieves. How and where people from such different worlds managed to meet remains a mystery, but this trinity is gonna be our main characters for today. The party went on as usual until one of the trio made a proposal that would forever inscribe their names in the criminal history of the USSR. Who do you think suggested robbing a bank? Two thieves who had firmly linked their lives to a crime, or a bank employee who had never broken the law? If you choose the last option, congratulations, you guessed right. Zaven Bagdasaryan proposed a plan to rob a bank. The role of implementers was assigned to the Kalachan cousins. At first, Nikolai and Felix Kalachan absolutely refused this idea. No one had ever robbed banks in the USSR. Such a phenomenon simply didn't exist. But why? The first reason is quite trivial. The bank security was at good level and nobody wanted to get involved into a shootout. But there was a second, more compelling reason. It was all about the economic system in the Soviet Union. The problem was, even if you had a huge amount of money, you just couldn't spend it. In the Soviet Union, in order to buy something expensive and therefore rare, an ordinary person had to get in line, which means you were put into an official state list and had to wait your turn to buy something, for example, an apartment or a car. And even if you had money to buy 10 apartments and 5 cars, you just couldn't go buy them, but you had to wait, and you had to wait for a very, very long time. The only thing left was to waste your money at parties and in restaurants. But here you have to be careful too. An ordinary worker living half of his monthly salary a day would immediately catch the attention of police and secret services. So it turned out that there was no point in taking risks robbing the bank. Therefore, ordinary criminals preferred petty thefts and other minor crimes. The Kalachan cousins were doing just such things and didn't even think about robbing a bank. Even organized mobs didn't dare to do such a thing at that time. But the story of their comrade and future accomplice was inspiring them with confidence and success with every word. And after Bagdasaryan finished, the whole job for the cousins began to seem very simple. The reason was that one of the most important buildings in Armenia, namely the state bank, was practically unguarded. Thus, our trio of robbers began to develop a plan. The thing is that the building of the State Bank of the Armenian Republic itself fully met the task. The high ground floor with 6 stone walls seemed a solid barrier for any robber. But there is one but. For reasons that history is silent about, the most valuable thing, the vault with the money, wasn't located in the basement like in all banks, but in an ordinary room on the second floor. And the key moment was that there was a residential building right next to the bank. The same style was evident in all the deaths of the Kalachan cousins. They didn't want to threaten people with weapons, and it was too difficult for them to open locks. So, they developed a simple but labor-intensive way to get inside the desired areas. Using construction tools, they simply dismantled one of the walls and went inside. As it turned out, this tactic was ideal for the case in the state bank. Some of you may notice that even under these circumstances, it's almost impossible to get past the security to the second floor, and even if it's possible, what to do with the alarm? According to the bank employee, there was an alarm on the walls and on the door, but it was missing in one place, on the ceiling of the vault. It was the part of the room that became the target of our robbers. The plan was following. The cousins make their way into the attic of the residential building at night and, as usual, begin to dismantle the wall and get inside. According to the plan, having dismantled the wall, Felix Kalachan was supposed to get on the third floor of the bank, which was not equipped with an alarm. Then, he makes his way to the right room, about the vault, and begin to dismantle the floor and make a hole down. And then, even a child can handle it. Take the money and leave. That's a great plan, like it was said. It's a Swiss watch. The robbery was scheduled for Friday, and from that moment, everything happened to our robbers can be called nothing but miracles. Throughout all this story, the robbers will be an inch away from failure, but the criminal providence will always help them to move forward. A few days before the X-Day, Kalachan cousins were returning home in a taxi and got into a serious accident. Only by a miracle they managed to avoid casualties. If the impact had been a little to the left, it's highly unlikely that Nikolai and Felix Kalachan would have become the heroes of our story. But still, they didn't manage to avoid losses. Nikolai Kalachan was seriously injured in the accident and was immediately taken to the hospital where he underwent surgery. When he came to his senses, he invited Felix to the hospital and told him not to cancel the robbery under any circumstances. So, on the night of the 5th of August, Felix Kalachan made his way to the attic of the residential building located next to the bank and laid out his tools. He had a brace, several drills, a rope, a crowbar, several bottles of sparkling water, and an umbrella. And no, it was not raining outside, and got to work. After several hours of hard work, Felix realized that things were bad. The wall was 3 bricks thick, and make a hole in it to get inside was very hard and time-consuming. And he still had to break the floor of the bank, take the money, and go back out. Obviously, there was not enough time for all this. Frustrated by the failure, Felix went onto the roof to smoke. Mentally saying goodbye to a rich life, Kalachan slowly looked around the bank building and suddenly noticed that the window on the third floor of the bank was open. More precisely, it was not even open. It was simply not there. The opening was covered with film. The thing was that at that time the bank was just starting renovations. Realizing that this was his only chance, Felix Kalachan decided to jump. What do you think the chances are jumping from the roof on one house to the window of another? But here too, the criminal providence didn't fail, or the Felix physical condition didn't fail. The thing is that the Felix Kalachan was former professional gymnast. Anyway, according to the plan or not, the robber was there. Having made his way into the right room, Kalachan began to dismantle the floor and make a hole in the ceiling. This was not an easy task. After several hours, Felix was literally dying of thirst. But trouble awaited him again. He drank all the water that was brought. He couldn't stand it. Therefore, having abandoned everything, Kalachan decided to go down the rope and went to the fountain, which was next to the bank. Having quenched his thirst, the robber dropped everything and went home. I bet each of you just exclaimed, "What? How is this even possible?" In fact, Felix Kalachan hasn't got crazy. The thing is that we are in the USSR, and this is happening on Saturday. And for every Soviet worker, Saturday is the holy day, because no one can ever be dragged to work on their legal day off. That's why Felix Kalachan didn't risk anything when he left all the tools on the bank floor, since it was completely obvious that no one would show up there on the weekend. So, the next day the war continued, and finally the sacred wall became visible in the hole in the floor. Felix tied a rope and went down into the wall, when suddenly you might have a question. How you can punch a hole in the ceiling and not attract the attention of guards? After all, during the work, the heavy stone parts would fall to the floor and create a decent noise. That's what the umbrella was for. This way, all the concrete parts fell to the umbrella without making any noise. So this time everything went well. Kalachan put all the money into the bag and successfully disappeared. Having arrived home, the robbers counted their loot and were stunned. 1.5 million rubles. For comparison, the average salary at that time was 180. But one thing separated our heroes from the rich life. The thing is, all the stolen money was a brand new 100-ruble banknotes with the series AE. And since this case was extraordinary, it was immediately reported to Moscow, and it was taken under the special control. But there was only one question: how to transport 1.5 million in cash and not get caught by police. After all the city was under control. And for this, Nikolai Kalachan decided to use his girlfriend, Ludmila Aksionova. And he used her, like we say in Russia, в темную. This means Ludmila knew absolutely nothing. In this regard, Nikolai Kalachan made a proposal to leave Armenia as soon as possible. But where to go? Of course to Moscow, probably the only city in the USSR where big money wouldn't arouse suspicion. The accomplices agreed. The couple arrived at the station with a large suitcase with money. It was obvious to Nikolai that the man with the large suitcase would most likely attract the attention of the police. So, he sent Ludmila alone, citing the fact that he needed to go to the toilet, and said that he would catch up with her. Thus, Ludmila took the suitcase and headed for the train. But the next second the plan almost failed. A policeman came up to Ludmila and asked her to open her suitcase. And it would seem that's it. The case is solved, criminals are caught, and money is returned. But the criminal providence didn't fail here either. Having foreseen such a problem, Nikolai Kalachan put a gramophone case in a large suitcase and then hid money in it. Watching Ludmila opening the suitcase, Nikolai ran up to the policeman and began to loudly complain, saying, "Why are you bothering people? And even ladies? And also we're late. Take this troshka, 3 rubles, and go." And policeman simply left. Thus, the story of our lucky robbers continues. Having finally reached Moscow, the robbers started to live a luxurious life. Constant parties at restaurants, life in expensive hotels. But when Ludmila asked Nikolai where they got so much money from, he answered he was a really nice gambler, and all the money was his winnings. However, at the same time, Nikolai was thinking about how to launder their jackpot, because It was clear that the police were closely monitoring the AI series banknotes. Indeed, after the robbery, all the information about stolen banknotes was immediately sent to all the bank branches and stores of the Union. And this measure was quite useful, but as it always happens, an ordinary employee or salesperson in a store didn't care about the type of money they were given. That's why the luxurious life of our robbers continued. However, spending whole days in restaurants was getting boring, and it was absolutely impossible to spend money in a big way. That's why Nikolai Kalachan came up with a plan. He told Ludmila that he had recently won a large sum of money, and since the gambling was prohibited in the USSR, the winnings had to be laundered. It was quite easy to do. You had to buy the government bonds, which could be easily exchanged for the clean rubles. Nikolai and Felix themselves couldn't do this, because an Armenian person with a large sum in the bank would immediately arouse suspicion. For this reason, they needed someone who could do this, and this someone was found. It turned out to be Ludmila's brother, Vladimir Kuznetsov, who worked in taxi. Kalachan cousins offered Vladimir twice as much money as he earned in the taxi, and told him that the work would be easy, and he didn't have to do anything. For the first time, company decided to fly away from Moscow to distant Tashkent. Nikolai believed that the further from decision-making center, which was Moscow, the less attention would be paid to these decisions. And he was absolutely right. Vladimir Kuznetsov went around all the Tashkent banks and bought the bonds for several thousand rubles with no problem. Having celebrated another success, the company decided to return to Moscow, where Vladimir spent his days going to banks buying bonds. He crumpled the money, soaked it in water so that the banknotes seemed old, and it worked. Despite all the instructions from above, no one put attention to the bills, and nobody knows how much money the robbers could have laundered if not as simple negligence. The Kalachan cousins gave Vladimir Kuznetsov a pretty simple task: to buy the bonds for small amounts of money and not attract the attention, which he did, but soon he got bored going to the banks with small amounts of money, because literally no one paid attention to him. That's why he decided to buy the bonds for larger amounts. Firstly, he came with 1,000 of rubles, then with 2,000, and finally he brought 6,000 of rubles to a small bank in Moscow. For reference, you could buy a nice car for 6,000. Obviously, such a large sum attracted the attention of the bank employee, and she remembered Vladimir's appearance well, and noticed that he was driving away from the bank in a green Moskvich. The money was examined by the police, and it immediately became clear that they had managed to get on the trail of the criminals. All the city police officers were given a description. It was not difficult to catch the robbers. Having arrested the Kalachan cousins and Vladimir Kuznetsov, the police managed to find stolen money in the car. It turned out that in 10 months, the Kalachan cousins managed to spend 200,000 rubles. Let me remind you that the average monthly salary was 180. In court, Nikolai Kalachan tried to appeal the fact he knew absolutely nothing. Moreover, he was in hospital at the time of the robbery. But, surprisingly, the court didn't believe his tearful story. The sentence was short: execution. Of course, this crime was extraordinary by the standards of Soviet Union, and a huge amount of money was stolen. But in the end, the Kalachan cousins didn't kill anyone, didn't injure anyone, didn't even scare anyone. Why execute them? Surprisingly, Providence played its role here too. Even Supreme Court of Armenia asked for cousins' pardon, and strangely enough, Moscow responded with consent. Pardon. This is how the story of the greatest bank robbery in the USSR could have ended. It could have, if at the last and most important moment in the life of Kalachan cousins, Providence and luck hadn't laughed in their faces and abandoned them. The letter, with permission to pardon, reached the servants of Armenian prison a day after the execution.